Third annual Shirley Mullen Lectureship. And I've got a few thank yous to get through, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about the lectureship, and then I'll introduce our speaker. So thanks to the folks from Lucky, Carl Sisson and Greg Bish for helping us do some logistics. Thank you to Karen for doing a lot of detail work. Thank you to Ben in IT, to Ellen, who's here, one of my student pre-law fellows who's done a lot of shuttling for us, and to Peter Mylander, who is away, he's across the pond, but will be checking up on me later on by video. If you would like to get around the table credit for this, you can kind of catch the scan now. I'm going to mute it during the lecture, but then I'll put it back up when we're done if you want to come back and get your credits. The Shirley A. Mullen Lectureship was established to honor the dual legacies of Catherine W. Lindley and President Shirley A. Mullen as history professors who cultivated students in an appreciation for the importance of history in the Christian liberal arts, for the church, and for lives of service in the world. The lectureship invites speakers from a range of Christian traditions who combine thoughtfulness and intellectual rigor with the spirit of hospitality and gracious civil discourse in the context of our pluralistic culture. It thus challenges students to emulate these same qualities as they join the fellowship of potent scholar servants, exemplified by Dr. Lindley and President Mullen. We had a wonderful dinner beforehand with the speaker in which I wish you could all hear the way in which we reflected on the legacy of Dr. Lindley, but also on the ongoing way in which this is being carried forward at Houghton. And this is a further step in that wonderful tradition. Our speaker this evening is Dr. Tracy McKenzie, who is a professor of history at Wheaton College, where he holds the Arthur Holmes Chair of Faith and Learning. Prior to coming to Wheaton, he taught for 20-some years at the University of Washington. And before that, he did his graduate work, his PhD from Vanderbilt, and his undergrad at Tennessee. He has a kind of two equally impressive, I think, scholarly careers. He's published a pair of award-winning books on the Civil War and on cultural division during the Civil War, One South of Many, and Lincolnites and Rebels, with Cambridge and Oxford, so he's no slouch as a scholar. But you probably are more familiar with him if you're familiar with his work, which is a kind of a presentation of history toward the church. The first book that I remember reading and being impressed by was a piece that InterVarsity published called The First Thanksgiving. And more recently, We the Fallen People. And his present lecture is a presentation of his next book project entitled The Almighty Has Its Own Purposes. Please join me in giving an enthusiastic open welcome to Professor Tracy McKenzie.
Good evening, everyone. I'm really glad to be here. I'm going to take a drink of water really quickly. Thank you for the introduction, Chris. I just want to say how delighted I am to be here. I think you had this sense from the introduction that I really think of myself as having two careers. I taught for 22 years at a research university, and I came to believe gradually over that time something that the scholar George Marsden said, which is that today's secular academy is hollow at its very core. The University of Washington had wonderful faculty, wonderful resources, but it was hollow at its core. And then I had the opportunity to come to Wheaton College, and I immediately fell in love. It was the home I had been missing for my whole career. And so anytime I have the opportunity to connect with other Christian institutions that take their Christian faith, their Christian identity seriously, I feel always that I'm meeting kindred spirits. If you're a student here tonight, can I just say that the opportunity that you have is precious beyond measure. It may be very difficult for you always to appreciate that from time to time, from day to day. But I think as your life continues, it will be more and more and more clear to you. This is an opportunity that most of the world, most of the United States does not have. Well, I'm horrible at titles. And so the title that I chose is possibly cryptic. Let me just explain it really quickly. The first part of the title is a passage, a phrase, quoted directly from Abraham Lincoln's Second Inaugural Address. The subtitle refers to Lincoln's correction of the Gettysburg Address. So let me just sort of let you know right now, we're going to be looking at those two speeches very closely. I hope everyone has received a handout which has the text of both of those speeches, plus one other memorandum that Abraham Lincoln wrote pretty much for himself at some time during the American Civil War. I've tried to bold certain words or phrases that I'm going to highlight. I've underlined certain words or phrases that I'll highlight as well, and I'll explain that in a little bit. So we're going to be looking at both speeches, but just so you know, we're really going to be focusing primarily on the Gettysburg Address. And I'm going to challenge you, I hope, to revisit what is a very familiar text for many of us, and to see it really with new eyes. So, let's think about these two speeches. Lincoln delivers one. Let's do a little bit of context. He delivers one in Pennsylvania Cemetery in the fall of 1863. The American Civil War has emerged in 1861. It's going to rage until 1865. So in November of 1863, the war is about 2.5 years old. The human cost of the American Civil War was enormous. Historians have upgraded or elevated the estimated death toll of the war in the last decade or so. For years, in fact for decades, the assumption was the death toll was around 620,000. That number has now increased to about 800,000. So to put that into our context today, the United States was to suffer a similar loss of life in a military venture. We would be talking about between 8 and 9 million casualties. So Lincoln is delivering the Gettysburg Address in the middle of a war that is far longer than anyone had anticipated and far costlier than anyone had imagined. The second address, the Second Inaugural Address, he delivers 16 months later. Now the political context is very different. Almost any objective bystander realizes the war is almost coming to a close. And in fact, it will end in another 5 weeks after Lincoln delivers his inaugural address. And as many of you, I guess, know, Lincoln will be assassinated 5 days after that. Well, these are two of the most important addresses, the most important speeches in American history. They're the most famous of Lincoln's presidency. I think they're the two greatest speeches by any American president. I would argue that they're the two greatest speeches by any American. And I would say undeniably that they've been influential in shaping the story that Americans tell ourselves about who we are. That is to say, they're particularly influential in what scholars tend to refer to as civil religion, which has some technical definitions, but I like to think of as the story that we tell ourselves about the religious meaning of America. So as arguably the two most important speeches in that tradition, it's entirely fitting that each of these speeches is etched on a wall, an interior wall, of the Lincoln Memorial. I don't know how many of you possibly have visited that memorial. It's the most widely visited historical monument in the United States today. About 8 million people visit any given year. In the peak times in the summer, it's about 40 visitors a minute throughout the day. I think there's a subliminal message, an unstated message to the Lincoln Memorial. You walk up the 58 steps toward the 20-foot-high Lincoln. You look to your left, to Lincoln's right. You see the words, the Gettysburg Address. You look to your right, Lincoln's left. You see the words of his Second Inaugural speech. And the unstated message, I believe, it's kind of forest for the trees kind of thing. We rarely, I think, stop to notice it. The unstated message is that these two speeches are, in fact, compatible. There's nothing in the memorial that suggests that we need to choose between the two. We're not supposed to cling to the one and despise the other. I think we're invited to agree with both, to revere both, to be convicted by both, to be challenged and inspired by both. They are two complementary halves of a coherent whole, each with words of wisdom that visitors should enshrine in their hearts and strive to live up to. I guess the thesis of my talk is that this is correct and profoundly misleading. And it really depends on the dimension of the speeches that we're focusing on when we compare them. I think what complicates the task is that they really mix genres, if you want to think of it in that terminology. Both of them, for example, include political argument. It's not readily apparent to modern readers because we've forgotten the context long ago. We don't see the speech's political edge because we don't remember the setting in which it was delivered. At the time, individuals would have seen them as having clear political implications. At Gettysburg, the president was defending his administration in the middle of a bloodbath, an incredibly costly war, with no end of the killing and dying in sight. In the Second Inaugural, he was laying the groundwork for post-war policy, now that victory was almost certainly near at hand. If the speeches do differ in emphasis, and they do, the differences are readily explained by their contexts. In addition to political argument, both of these speeches have moral exhortation. I'd be willing to believe that that's the element of these speeches that we tend to recall. Again, the emphases are different, but they're not in tension with one another. They're not irreconcilable. The Gettysburg Address stresses the need for genuine equality. The Second Inaugural underlines the importance of charity and humility. Each calls us to certain kind of work. The Gettysburg Address calls us to preserve our precarious democracy. The Second Inaugural challenges Americans to pursue peace among ourselves and with all nations, as the wording suggests. In a moment, today, when our country is more divided than at any time since Lincoln delivered these speeches, I find these exhortations eerily timely. If enough of us took them to heart, wouldn't we all be better off? No need to choose which speech to embrace and apply. We can absorb it all. So both speeches have political argument. Both include moral exhortation. But ultimately, and most importantly, both speeches tell stories. I'm absolutely convinced that this is their most important, most powerful, most profound dimension. Human beings are storytelling creatures. For all practical purposes, the reality we inhabit is the story we tell ourselves. So yes, it is natural to tell stories. I love a quote from a now late historian named Gerda Lerner. She wrote once, "We live our lives, we tell our stories. It is as natural as breathing." But stories are not just natural, they're essential. I love the quote here from the late social critic Neil Postman. Postman wrote, "Human beings require stories to give meaning to our lives. They help us understand why we're here. They answer the question, who am I?" In Postman's words, without a story, ourselves die. So stories are natural, stories are essential, but not just any kind of story. Here I just want to draw from the work of a scholar at Columbia named Andrew Delbanco. Wrote a wonderful book now a quarter century ago called The Real American Story. The Real American Dream. Forgive me. Delbanco says that human beings need to organize their lives into a story that gives them hope. When he talks about hope, a story that leads somewhere, a story that leads to hope, he isn't referring to a sort of vanilla sense of optimism. He's not talking about the kind of hope that we might have to get into that good graduate school after graduation, or to land the kind of job that we desire, or to meet and ultimately connect with that ideal life partner. It's not even a more materialistic kind of goal to amass wealth, to inhabit that sort of stereotypical home in the suburbs with a two-car garage. According to Delbanco, the hope that he has in mind is something very, very different. It's the sense of comfort that saturates our souls when we believe that our lives are a part of something larger. Hope inhabits us when we see our lives as part of a larger story. So the real American dream, Delbanco says, is not even peculiarly or uniquely American. It's the hope of satisfying the unquenchable human need to feel connected to something larger than the self. The craving for transcendence. So I love this schema, and I want to use it now for us to make sense of Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address and his Second Inaugural. Let's back away for the moment and think big picture. I want to argue that the 19th century is a transitional period in the story, the dominant story, that Americans tell themselves in the quest of hope. We go back, and I'm generalizing very broadly, but let's go back to 17th and 18th century America. And let's ask, what's the dominant story that American colonists are situating their lives in? It's a story in which the central figure is God. God's sovereignty drives the plot of the human story. His divine plan, which may be inscrutable, nonetheless infuses their lives with meaning and purpose. The 19th century, in one sense then, is a story of how that dominant narrative is gradually, almost imperceptibly eroded and replaced. The central character ceases to be God and becomes what? The nation. It becomes the nation. I want to suggest that no single figure in American history is more influential in driving that transition than Abraham Lincoln. I think this is a helpful way to think about his speeches, at least when we think of them as conveying stories. In both speeches, Lincoln is telling a story about the meaning of the American Civil War that was then raging. More deeply, he is telling stories about the meaning of America. Most deeply, he's telling a story about America's God. They are not compatible stories. So let's think about Gettysburg first of all. We'll ask the question, what kind of story is it? Well, let me start with the firmest sort of assertion I can make. It is a short story. If you count the words, 272 words. Would have taken Lincoln probably about 2.5 minutes to deliver. It was by far the shortest part on the program. The featured speaker at Gettysburg was a man named Edward Everett. He was an academic, which meant he was long-winded. He gave a 2-hour oration. The Presbyterian minister who opened the ceremony prayed for 10 minutes. One of Abraham Lincoln's secretaries said of the prayer, it was a prayer that thought it was an oration. Lincoln's remarks, comparison, so short. Almost the first thing that all the bystanders or those who were present in the audience at the time commented on. They weren't expecting the President of the United States to give such a short, dedicatory remark. So it's short. Its structure, second point, is simple. I don't know anyone who would deny that. We boil it down. has a really kind of clear tripart structure referring to past, present, future. Boiled down, the President tells his audience the United States from its founding had been defined by the commitment to a particular ideal. He goes on to say that the country is now in the grips of a costly conflict to perpetuate that ideal. And looking ahead, that the unfinished task of the living was to continue the struggle begun by those who had died for that ideal. So it's short, its structure is simple. But does it have a religious essence or dimension to it? So I just said it's one of the most important speeches in shaping American civil religion. Does it convey a religious message? Well, historians have been fascinated with that question for a very long time. And they tend to approach it in one particular way. They've got out their microscopes or their magnifying glasses, and they've parsed word by word by word for hidden clues of Lincoln's faith and of the kind of religious inspiration of his rhetoric. So over the years, historians have lavished praise on the way that this speech echoes scriptural language, or has Christian overtones, or carries the rhythms of the Bible, or the cadences of the King James. One scholar, for example, an English professor, has made the conclusion that of the 272 words in the Gettysburg Address, 269 can be found in the King James Version of the Bible. Not that you care, but that included 13 iterations of the word that, which is the most common word, 11 instances of thee, 10 of we. You know, you can just say that as to suggest that this doesn't prove a whole lot. But others have been less sort of systematic, but have zeroed in key passages and said, surely these are revealing. So they'll call attention, for example, to the phrase, brought forth. Why didn't Lincoln just say, our forefathers founded? Why does he say the country was brought forth? Well, Mary brought forth Jesus. Maybe Lincoln is thinking about that as he chooses his words. They call attention to hallowed, to new birth, even to fourscore. Fourscore does appear, by the way, in the King James Bible in multiple instances, a handful. One scholar says, for example, that by using fourscore as the very first phrase in the Gettysburg Address, that Lincoln succeeded at the outset to imbue the dedication at Gettysburg with theological import. I am not persuaded by that. Particularly the last time I went to Gettysburg, one of the first things I noticed as I was driving down the street was the Fourscore Brewery. And I'm asking myself exactly, what's the theological import that's going on in this particular. So let me make clear what I'm saying. I'm not saying that Lincoln's words or choice of words is irrelevant. I don't believe that. But I do actually think that this is the wrong question to ask. I want to go back to Del Blanco's schema that he's given us. He's talking about what is the story that is the dominant narrative Americans tell, and who is its pivotal figure or its central character. Remember, in the colonial world, according to Del Blanco, that central character was God. So let's ask the question of the Gettysburg Address, who is the central character in the story? Well, I'm going to go out on a limb here. I'm going to say it is definitely not God. He is either missing completely or given a cameo. 2 words. Do you notice those words? Under God. I'll be very honest with you, and maybe later when we have some discussion, maybe you can tell me what you think that means. There is good evidence that Lincoln did not include that phrase in the draft that he brought with him to Gettysburg. Scholars who have studied most closely suggest that he almost certainly added that in a kind of impromptu or extemporaneous way. At least in terms of his published correspondence and speeches, he never used the term until 10 days before he was inaugurated as president. And then he almost never used it afterward. we can find 3 instances in which he did, and exactly what he meant is hard to pin down. We might emphasize that it was an afterthought. Alexander Hamilton is supposed to have said once when asked why the Constitution didn't mention God, and his answer was supposed to have been, "We forgot." You might argue that Lincoln forgot about God until the last minute. He said, "Oh yeah, I should acknowledge." Or we might say that his sort of clear decision to include that speaks a lot. And honestly, I don't know which way to read that. At the very least, we might say charitably that is acknowledging that the universe is not closed, that there is a Lord of the universe. But having said that, if we ask the question, who is the central character, who is doing the work here, again, it's not God. It's either our forefathers, as he mentions at the opening, or it's those soldiers who here gave their lives, but it's not God. However heroic those figures might be, they are earthbound. Now, you may not arrive at the conclusion that I've arrived at, but I do think that one of the helpful ways to see this more clearly is to put Lincoln's Gettysburg Address in context. As a historian, we think context is hugely illuminating. And I think it is here as well. Let me tell you what I have in mind. Let's think about the messages emanating from northern pulpit after pulpit after pulpit after pulpit in the first 2.5 years of the American Civil War. And let's compare Lincoln's remarks at Gettysburg with those messages. Now, I'm not suggesting that all northern clergy are saying exactly the same thing. But they agree enough, their emphases overlap enough, that we can talk about there being essentially a common set of observations. And those are 3 in number that I can identify. The first is that God is sovereign over all, including every detail of the war then raging. I want to share you some of the quotes. I'm not going to try to identify individuals because it would bog us down too much, but these are all direct quotes. Northern congregations are hearing that, quote, our national trial is ordered by God, that God can and will control it, that God really governs the world, that He maintains a universal, constant superintendence over the affairs of the earth, that His agency is at work in all national history and life. Almost no one wanted to leave it at that. What everyone really wanted to know in the midst of this costly, painful crisis was not whether God was at work, but why. What was His plan? Why had He allowed or caused this tragedy to happen? Can we still be assured of God's favor? Do we have reason to believe that things will come out right in the end? Well, I think that northern pastors were on firm ground in reminding their congregations of divine sovereignty. Absolutely. God works all things according to the counsel of His will, the Apostle Paul instructed the early church. Not a single sparrow falls to the ground apart from the Father's will, Jesus Himself had taught. But while the Bible is emphatic about divine sovereignty, I'm not so sure it teaches that we can reliably interpret God's purposes in any given scenario. In fact, you might argue the opposite is closer to the truth. My thoughts are not your thoughts, says the Lord through the prophet Isaiah. How unsearchable are God's judgments, Paul marvels, and unfathomable His ways. Jesus Himself made clear that we probably deceive ourselves when we think we can reduce God's ways to a simple formula. He taught that prosperity is sometimes a sign of divine favor, but not always. God caused the rain to fall on the just and the unjust. Adversity is sometimes a sign of God's judgment, but not always. Think about the man born blind that Jesus speaks about. The reality is, though, the northern clergy, for all practical purposes, don't agree with what I just shared. What they conclude almost always is that God's purposes for the war were entirely transparent. So they saw two things that God was doing. He's sovereign, what is he doing, and why? First of all, he is clearly judging the nation, north as well as south. As one pastor put it, national calamities are sure tokens of national sins, just as national prosperities are sure tokens of national virtues. Country suffering, it follows axiomatically that this is a divine rebuke. God is judging us. Well, why? Why is God judging the land? I think we have enough time. I'll share you part of the list. Starts with intemperance, violation of the Sabbath, covetousness, avarice, adultery, ingratitude, licentiousness, pride, extravagance, swearing, arrogance, lewdness, gambling, corruption of manners, disrespect of parents, neglect of the Bible, neglect of prayer, and a constitution that neglects God. That's partial list. Some things they emphasize more heavily and usually at the top of the list. Henry Ward Beecher, maybe that's a name you'll recognize, arguably the most influential pastor of that generation, noted with bitter irony how, quote, the freest and most boastfully religious people on the globe are absolutely fatal to any weaker people that they touch. Byron Sunderland is probably not a name that you would recognize, but he was the chaplain of the United States Senate during the Civil War. And Sunderland, in a message to the assembled Congress, lamented what he called the spirit of cruelty and oppression which has marked the white race of America toward non-white peoples. Regularly, they're going to tick off three groups: indigenous Americans, Africans and African Americans, and Mexicans. God is sovereign. God is judging the entire land for manifold sins. Third thing, and in some sense maybe the paramount thing, God has entrusted the United States a unique divine mission to the world. That unshakable foundation becomes the filter through which they read God's judgment. A few quotes again here. The United States has been given a great philanthropic mission to convince the world of the permanency and strength of free institutions. The country is to be a, quote, great evangel of liberty and religion among the nations of the earth. The role of the country is, quote, to disseminate the principles of civil liberty and to engage in a special mission on behalf of the kingdom of His Son. Never was so grand a mission on such a scale committed to any nation. What does this mean when we put these two together? Pastors reassured their congregation, because of the country's divine mission, that it cannot be possible that God is through with the nation yet. This country has a high and holy destiny yet to accomplish, congregations are told. It was impossible to imagine that God would allow of its perishing now. Another quote, God will not remove so great and powerful a nation for which He has done so much till it has fulfilled its mission. There's more work to be done. So what does this mean? Probably the most common metaphor that ministers will use is that of a father, a loving father, and a disobedient child. Over and over again, pastors will speak of the Lord's chastening. They'll cite the New Testament principle that whom the Lord loves, He chastens. They insist that God is inflicting suffering on the nation in mercy, not in wrath. He's calling the nation to repent. He is purifying the nation by fire. So let's think about these just to review. God is sovereign. He is actively judging the nation for its sins. that he is not retracting the nation's particular mission to the world. Back to Gettysburg. Let's revisit the Gettysburg Address now with that as our context or background. The difference, I think, is stark. The framework is a closed universe. The cast of characters, however heroic, are earthly. And yet, there are similarities. I think the Gettysburg Address is many things, but surely one thing is it is a classic example of rhetoric that conflates sacred and secular. Lincoln offered at Gettysburg an effort to situate the tragedy of the American Civil War in a story of hope, a larger story of redemption. But the thing being redeemed in the Gettysburg Address is not the Church of God, but the United States. The author of redemption is not the God who died that sinful humans might live, but the Union soldiers who died that this nation might live. And this nation, Lincoln implies, is the hope of the world. Let me convince you of this. First of all, notice, in the Gettysburg Address, whatever Lincoln was thinking privately, the text of his remarks does not emphasize judgment. Instead, it points to national mission. You might look, if you wish, at the handout that we've distributed and glance at those words of the Gettysburg Address. If you look at that second paragraph, short paragraph, we're engaged in the Great Civil War, testing whether that nation what? Or any nation so conceived, so dedicated, can endure. That any nation is, I think, hugely important. It expands the focus from a trial for the survival of the United States to a trial for the future survival of self-government around the globe. If you look at the last paragraph, probably the single most recognizable passage is Lincoln's reference to government of the people, by the people, and for the people. Right? In his original draft, what he had written is that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that this government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish. But you see what he did in his final modification? Crossed out the word this. Excuse me, it's this. So it becomes not this government, but government. What is at stake in the American Civil War is self-government on trial for all time. Now, in the very severe space that Lincoln had, the 272 words, he can't develop this at great length, but he is echoing something he has said in other instances. On his way to his inauguration in the late days of February 1861, he stops and he speaks at Independence Hall in Philadelphia, and he tells the audience that the Declaration of Independence had given liberty not alone to the people of this country, but hope to the world for all future time. In his annual message to Congress in December of 1862, he described the Union as, quote, the last best hope of earth. You may recognize that phrase. Here's what I would want to stress. He's actually echoing the Northern clergy. Because this idea that the United States is the hope of the world is a common theme in Northern sermons. Let me just give you some quotes. Ministers tell their congregations, quote, no event that has occurred in human history would so shape the foundations of hope among the friends of man than the class of the United States. The hopes of the world, I'm quoting again, will live or perish with its success or failure. The world's best hopes, another quote, rest on the outcome. Upon the success of this country hung, quote, the dearest earthly hopes. Should the Union fall, quote, mankind in all succeeding ages will abandon hope. Defeat would cause, quote, to perish the brightest hopes of universal man. Should the rebellion prevail, should the United States fall, it will be, quote, the darkest day the world has seen since the fall of man. And why? Quote, the The hopes of the world rest on this covenant. I want to tell you that at Gettysburg, Abraham Lincoln agreed with that. I also want to tell you as emphatically as I can that the hope of the world does not rest on any nation, any party, any political leader. What those ministers were doing, what Abraham Lincoln was echoing in a fainter way, was sacralizing the nation. He does that in another way, in the choice of words. He tells us that, quote, the brave men who struggled at Gettysburg had consecrated the ground. To consecrate is to set apart as sacred. Something that is consecrated is now holy. When the great I Am speaks to Moses in Exodus chapter 15, he informs the trembling herdsman who comes to see the burning bush that he is standing on holy ground. Lincoln told his audience at Gettysburg the same thing. That makes little difference whether you believe he was speaking figuratively or literally. In his choice of words, he was draping the nation with religious imagery and with eternal significance. And that, I think, is a form of patriotic heresy. Again, he was echoing the clergy. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but here's just a few more quotes. Ministers are telling their congregation that the Union cause is, quote, sacred. That those who died in battle had, quote, offered the most costly sacrifice. That they had laid their lives, quote, upon the altar of their native land. As soldiers, they were, quote, God's ministers, fueled by, quote, holy zeal, fighting in, quote, a holy conflict to defend, quote, sacred institutions. Those who died had offered their lives and won for themselves, quote, imperishable glory and a martyr's crown. Let's move forward to the Second Inaugural. And what I want you to, I hope, notice is this striking contrast. A word just very quickly about Lincoln's personal faith. I'm working on a book on the Gettysburg Address. I just finished a chapter on Lincoln's faith. I pose the question on the first line of the chapter, was Abraham Lincoln a Christian? And I tell the reader there's a short answer and a long answer. And the short answer is God alone knows. And I don't mean to be flippant or in any sense irreverent. I believe that. God alone knows. But we have to go a little bit farther than that at least. And here's what I think we would say. There's not a perfect consensus, but Lincoln scholars have a lot of agreement in a general sense. Lincoln was probably pretty palpably skeptical and scornful of organized religion as a young man. By his 20s, that's beginning to change. Certainly by his 40s, pretty clear that he's absolutely not an atheist. By the time that he enters the White House, and he's in his early 50s, it's almost certain now that he believes in what he would call providence. He believes in a sovereign God. He hopes, he aches for some sense of a divine meaning to the conflict. And in Gettysburg, I think he thought he knew what that was. Gettysburg, there's no ambivalence, there's no equivocation. Here is what the war is about. Here is what our task is. Somewhere along the line, in between Gettysburg and the Second Inaugural, Lincoln begins to revisit that question. And he sees it as more complicated and more mysterious than he ever had before. And by the time of the midpoint of the war, it seems to me, there's sort of three things that he's wrestling to sort of hold together simultaneously. He believes there is a God. He believes that God is sovereign. He believes that God has allowed the war to erupt. And he believes, and this is the most important, that God is allowing the war to continue. Mm-hmm. So he wrestles with that. He wrestles with what that means. And he does those in a variety of ways, but he does so most powerfully in the second document that you have here. I just want to call attention to it very quickly. Lincoln from time to time would write memos to himself, sort of have the sense that he's jotting down ideas, wrestling with them, thinking of the logic that's implied, thinking of ways to clarify as precisely as possible what he thinks must be true. This particular memorandum was found in Lincoln's personal papers after his death by his personal secretaries. There was no date on it. There was no title on it. They gave it the title Meditation on Divine Will, and they estimated that he wrote this document in September of 1862, less than a month before issuing the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. Historians now at least have raised doubt about that, because this memorandum was written on a piece of stationery that showed it had a picture of the unfinished dome of the United States Capitol, and at least as best we know, there are no extant instances of that stationery before the following year. Whether or not that definitively suggests that they were wrong to put it in 1862, I am convinced that it comes in 1863 or 1864 for two reasons. First of all, the thought that goes into this memorandum does not inform the Gettysburg Address that I can see in any palpable way. Secondly, he introduces ways of thinking that he repeats multiple times in other documents. I'm not going to go into that, but let's look at this really quickly. Start with the first sentence, the will of God prevails. It is impossible, I think, for us to capture the weight of those 5 words. We could just stop there and meditate on them for years. The will of God prevails. In great contests, each party claims to act in accordance with the will of God. Both may be and one must be wrong. Here is the attorney, Lincoln, who in his 30s said, I need to be able to think more logically. I think I will work page by page through the 6 volumes of Euclid's theorems. It's Lincoln saying the law of non-contradiction holds here. God cannot be for and against something at the same time. So what does that mean, Lincoln asked, in the present Civil War? The answer, it is quite possible that God's purpose is something different from the purpose of either party. And twice in this short document, he notes that the war's not ended yet, that the contest proceeds, and he struggles with why. Well, ultimately, this shapes the way he approaches his second inaugural address, and this is where we're going to end. How is that second inaugural different? I want to just point your attention to a couple of ways. First of all, God shows up. He's absolutely present. We see this in a variety of ways. We see it in the explicit quotations of Scripture. Now, I've underlined where those are. There are 3, they're pretty much verbatim quotations. There are 4 more that are maybe paraphrases, maybe, I think, inspired by other scriptural passages. The 703 words of the Second Inaugural mention God 8 times, explicitly. More importantly, it invokes a God who acts, a God who judges, a God who answers prayer. But I actually don't think this is the most compelling argument. Let's look at the text again of the document. Flip over that first paragraph. Go to the second one. The second and third paragraph is the meat of the Second Inaugural. And just look at the words that I put in bold. I want you to feel a kind of relentless hammering over and over and over again about the human desire for the war. Lincoln tells his audience that all, and he really means North and South, all dreaded war. All sought to avert war. One side sought to save the Union without war. Another sought to destroy the Union without war. Both parties deprecated war. And how does that paragraph end? And the war came anyway. Sorry, how you might put it. And then look down at the next paragraph. Neither party expected for the war the magnitude or the duration which it attained. Neither anticipated that the cause of the conflict, he means slavery, might cease before the conflict itself. Each looked for an easier triumph. Each anticipated a result less fundamental. It goes on down, it says, the prayers of both could not be answered. You see how those anticipations are consistently being thwarted. And what explains it all? The Almighty has His own purposes. This, I think, is where Lincoln ultimately lands. So note two things. The sacralization of the nation is gone in the Second Inaugural. It's not there. As is his confidence in the meaning of the war. It's not there, at least not to the same degree. And I want to suggest to you that this is a repudiation of the themes from the pulpit in the North, but also, in a certain sense, a correction of Lincoln himself. I think that that actually helps to make sense of Lincoln's own commentary on his Second Inaugural, which he penned 11 days after he delivered the address, in a short note to a very prominent behind-the-scenes Republican actor named Thurlow Weed. And this is what he wrote. Now, basically going to wrap things up with this quotation. Lincoln wrote, "Men are not flattered by being shown that there's been a difference of purpose between the Almighty and them. To deny it, however, in this case, is to deny that there is a God governing the world. It is a truth which I thought needed to be told. And as whatever of humiliation there is in it falls most directly on myself, I thought others might afford for me to tell it." The idea that he doesn't elaborate on, but he hints at, he's saying, I'm thinking of what I shared as, in some sense, exposing my own error. And I do believe, yes, that the Second Inaugural is Lincoln's correction of the Gettysburg Address. History can function in a number of valuable ways when we go to the past. As a form of memory, it aids our understanding. As a kind of mirror, it sharpens our self-perception. It's also a kind of conversation across the ages about what we should value and how we should live. In the midst of our nation's greatest trial, Abraham Lincoln wrestled with questions of profound importance. I think, in a polarized moment such as our current one, that we can benefit from hearing him and wrestling with the questions that he wrestled with. I want to stop here, but I'm going to tell you right now what my charge to you all is. I want to hear if you think this matters to today, and if so, why. That's where I'm going to stop at this point. I've been, yeah, fair enough. This is time. You're supposed to clap. Break for just a moment. If some of you need to excuse yourselves, you have other commitments or obligations. And then I'd love for us to have some Q&A, some conversation with one another, but it's entirely fine if anyone needs to slip out at this point. I don't know your name, so I can't ask you. Can I go ahead and ask then? Questions? Responses? Thoughts of any kind? So I tell my students there's a variety of ways to read silence. I actually think that one likely thing is that you have been utterly stunned by the insight of what you've heard and you're speechless. It's also possible that there's another explanation. I'll ask again. Any thoughts? I'll be very honest. I'm wrestling right now. I'm working on a book project. I'm wrestling right now how much to speak about the implications of this. There's one thing to call attention to pattern. It's a different thing as a historian to reflect on what that pattern means. I would love to hear any thoughts that you might have. Yes, sir.
Two trends you mentioned. One, that the center of the story changed from God to the nation. Would you put that around the time of the Civil War that the transition happened?
So, so the question is, if there is a transition going on from God being the central character of the story to the nation, is it right around the Civil War that that happens? And I think my answer would be that it's a more gradual process than that, but that the Civil War is clearly a key milestone along that path. What I wanted to, also want to sort of plant this idea, it's not the case that in the middle of the Civil War, Americans are saying, wow, our story is changing, and now it's becoming a really secular story. Because if you listen to what they're hearing when they go to church on Sunday, they're hearing all kinds of religious meaning being infused into that story. But the lines that separate how we speak about the nation and how we speak about God are becoming conflated. And that makes sense to me as a transition in this process. It's not that someday people woke up and said, up until this morning, I actually thought God was the center of all meaning, and now I'm going to say it's the nation. It becomes that gradual transition where gradually one begins to subvert the other. I was talking to a student, actually, are you Mark?
Yeah, Mark or Marcus.
Yes, I was talking with Mark at lunch today. We had a wonderful conversation. He brought up C.S. Lewis's book, The Screwtape Letters. One of the particular themes I love from Lewis is what he calls Christianity and he has the senior devil tell the junior devil, one of the ways that you can subvert your patient is to get them to link their Christianity with some other cause. And he says, at the moment that you've caused them to link them as inseparable, you've won your man. Because imperceptibly but inexorably, means and ends get changed. And actually, that is how I think the Civil War is playing a role here. But it's going to be probably generations, on down the road where Americans can look back and see that with clarity. There are, I should just say, there are some intellectuals who are deeply disturbed and disillusioned by what they see as the senseless loss of life in the American Civil War. So we do have individuals like Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., who just becomes, a very entrenched skeptic. But I don't think that they're representative of the sort of rank and file popular opinion. Yes, sir.
So I'm going to ask a cynical question. So we see this shift in this. I see the shift you're pointing out, and at the time of the Second Inaugural, Lincoln's battling forces in his own party too, in terms of how to approach relations with the defeated South, and all. I think what you're sharing about was in northern pulpits. I think there was a trend of emphasizing. I think there was a trend of emphasizing God's sovereignty in southern Christian circles as well, but obviously with different mindset. Is it possible Lincoln saw that this was kind of a cynical maneuver to potentially kind of find a common thread here to knit two warring factions together? I'm not sure how to phrase my question, but I guess
that's okay. So
yeah.
I will try to rephrase it only so the recording here can hear it, and I won't be able to do quite justice to it. But the question, as I understand it, is it possible that political context in March of 1865 are leading Lincoln to emphasize this as a way, I think you used the term, to help knit the nation back.
Given what we know about the ambiguity of his faith commitments.
Yeah. So is that possible? I cannot rule that out. Absolutely cannot rule that out. My own sense, having spent a lot of time with Lincoln at this point, and acknowledging that in many ways he is still inscrutable to me. I tend not to have that reading. When I read that short note that he sends to Thurlow Weed, which he had no reason to expect was going to be circulated, and he says, that part of this that was humiliating falls on me above all, I think he's revealing something that he did genuinely did struggle with. But having said all that, one of the things I want to emphasize, the scripture says, who knows the heart of man but the spirit of man within. And so I cannot tell you for sure what Lincoln's motivations are. So I want to keep the focus on what he actually writes in the way that it's been received. If I could just say one thing, if you think about these two speeches, one of them which sacralizes the nation and one which does not, which is the one that actually has been remembered? Well, if you go to Gettysburg today, I have no doubt which of those has been remembered. And one of the ways to do that, just look at the monuments. You know, they'll tell you it's the world's largest statuary garden. There's about 1,400 monuments at the Gettysburg National Historical Park. And they're going to use the language of Christianity and the church over and over again. These soldiers are martyrs. They have fought for a sacred cause and so on and on. So it's like Lincoln's word of warning just absolutely was disregarded. Oh, yes, sir.
Let me ask the question, are we being, this is go back to your question, which is looking at what we're arguing for today and understanding him and today's landscape, shall we say. Would we argue that Lincoln is an exception, that I put together thoughtful thinking and politician? Or are we being generous here? Or do I have contemporaries of his day that were as thoughtful as opposed to being expedient for the political moment?
So the question, again, I'll try to be true to the question, do we think of Lincoln as expedient or as deeply thoughtful and able to meld sort of deep thought with his role as a politician? I will put my cards on the table, and you might not know this from how critical I've been of the Gettysburg Address, but I have a lot of admiration for Abraham Lincoln. He thinks deeply. That's one thing that's absolutely clear. What I think Lincoln would probably not feel comfortable with is in his own description of himself, is pitting his deep thought with his commitment to his party. A lot of politicians, a lot of historians would say that Lincoln was a party man. They made no bones about that. He was absolutely thought of himself as the leader of a party as well as President of the United States. That's actually a point I want to make in the larger book. I think the Gettysburg Address is a partisan speech. And you're not going to probably believe that because he doesn't poke his fingers in the eyes of the other party. He doesn't ridicule or mock them. But the question that I would ask rhetorically, could a Democrat have given the speech that he gave? And the answer is absolutely not. There were now at least a decade, if not more, of connotations of the claim that the country was founded on the proposition that all men are created equal. So men like Stephen Douglas are going before audiences and saying, this is a libel on our illustrious fathers. I hold that they were not thinking of blacks at all or any other non-white peoples. So Lincoln chooses to lead with a resoundingly Republican assertion. Parenthetically, it's become very common for presidential candidates to go to Gettysburg now to give speeches. And I don't know if this has a long history, but if you go back to 2016, Donald Trump spoke there. 2020, Joe Biden had to speak there. And if you look at the coverage on both of those addresses, they are holding up the Gettysburg Address as unifying. This was a unifying speech. And of course, they're each accusing the other of being unable to unify the nation. But it wasn't a unifying speech at the time. It's unifying to us today, 163 years later, because we've lost a lot of that context. But at the time, out my way, the Chicago Tribune says, how dare he, this is a Democratic newspaper, how dare he libel the men who died? Because they weren't dying for equality. They were dying for something else. So he was partisan, but it's a positive partisanship that holds up a certain commitment without calling out the names of the party he attacks. Other questions, thought, reactions?
Are the audiences different?
That's a good question. I actually think that, so the question is, are the audiences different? And that is, by the way, a wonderful historical question to ask. Right? I would tell my students that's always something you want to consider. I actually think it's a national audience in both instances. That is to say, it's weird to us. It seems so foreign to us. Presidents don't speak much in public in the 19th century. They rarely do. One of the reasons we placed so much attention on the Gettysburg Address is this one of about 3 speeches that he gives outside of the circumference of Washington, D.C., Baltimore area. And so when he has the opportunity to speak where he's certain that there's going to be a large media presence, he knows that it's an opportunity to speak to the nation. It would have been considered unseemly for him to call a press conference, for example. But in instances like this, he's going to take advantage of it. So I believe the audience was always attending. I don't think it's a southern audience, I think it's a northern audience, but it's
Right.
definitely a broad.
It seems like the second one is a broader,
Yeah.
I'm trying to bring the nation back together, and I'm trying to,
Yeah, and
Listen to the Gettysburg
honestly,
Address from a Southern
I really
perspective,
don't
right?
think he's speaking to Southerners even
Yeah.
there. Not that there are Southerners listening to the address
Yeah.
or even reading it later. For all practical purposes, with exception, about 2 exceptions, all Southern newspapers are defunct by March of 1865. I think he's making a speech to radicals in his own party, as well as to Democrats about what he knows is going to be a contentious issue of post-war policy. That's my guess. Yes?
Do you think there's a role for any sort of civil religion today as Christians? Should we even think about, not like sacralizing, like Lincoln does, but like patriotism?
Yeah. So the question was a great one, and it's one of these that we could really have a wonderful conversation at length on, is there a place for civil religion from a Christian perspective? Is there a place that we could find acceptable, even positive in its impact? I'm not the expert on this, but just so a couple of thoughts. There's no one sort of transcendent, Platonic definition of civil religion. There's a whole literature out there. They all differ in a little respect. I've come down on the idea that the definition I like best, which is actually so broad it may not be appropriate, but I think it's the story that we tell ourselves about the meaning of America. And we tell that story in countless ways, in countless venues, in national historical sites like Gettysburg, in public events like a commemoration at Veterans Day, Memorial Day, but also in museums, in classrooms, online, everywhere. The scholar who probably crystallized this concept more than any other in the 20th century was a sociologist in California named Robert Bellah. And he was studying religion in a world context. He basically said, pretty much the best he could tell, every nation or people has a story it tells about what he called their religious self-understanding. So the way I would approach the question, is this good or bad, is to start with the idea it doesn't matter because it's inevitable. It's going to be here. We're not going to argue to eradicate it in some way. The other thing that I would say, not only is it inevitable, I actually think it is morally indeterminate. That is to say, I think we could tell a story ourselves that is just endorsing or affirming values that we want to see flourish in our society because it is a benefit to our neighbors. Because we are fallen, though, I think the potential for that to become something that is idolatrous is always there. So when you begin to see the movement change from, we can tell a story about ourselves to say, what we want to affirm above all is liberty. And we can have a good conversation about what that means. But we want to affirm liberty or democracy or religious freedom or opportunity, any number of things like that. But it seems so easy to begin to use language that is drawn from the religious sphere, that begins to be imputed to the civil sphere, and then we're beginning to, I think, cross the line into idolatry. So at the very least, it's a question that historians have to practice discernment on. I think probably we're not going to be able to eliminate it entirely, but to think about it uncritically is not wise. Yes, sir.
It seems an admirable thing to back off the idolatry, to put it strongly, of Gettysburg Address in favor of a more chastened sense of we're not maybe as purely righteous as we suppose ourselves to be. We might be subject to judgment ourselves. Although I was hearing that in some of the sermons even before, too, we all get punished. But is Lincoln still, the reason you might worry about it is that he could seem to be hedging on the sacredness of the cause, saying, if we shall suppose that American slavery is one of those offenses which in the province of God must need come, and then woe to those, I guess, through whom it's come, but that's all of us, he wants to say, and that's salutary, we all had a role. He could hedge on God being with the project of the Union while still insisting on the sacredness of the cause. But there's this hedging language in there. I'm wondering what your take is on how much he hedges on the sacredness of the cause.
So that's a super question, and I haven't worked through it entirely, but I do think I understand your question. So the question, to repeat, this gentleman has said there is the sort of sacralization of the nation, and there is the affirmation of the cause, of the values for which he says Union soldiers are fighting. By the way, Democratic newspapers, don't agree with that, at all. And I don't really think Lincoln surveyed many Union soldiers, actually, before he said what they were fighting for. Here's the thing. Totally significant, totally appropriate distinction to make. And you'll hear today when Americans debate whether nationalism is a good thing. They will say, well, there's the nationalism of certain kinds of creeds, of creedal commitments. And so what it means to be American is simply, can I become a part of a community that affirms certain values? You'll see that compared to what is sometimes called blood and soul nationalism. So it's not the creed that makes me an American, it's being born or being part of a particular lineage that makes me an American. So I think this is very relevant to our conversations today. Here's the problem with Lincoln. I think Lincoln would say, on one hand, what I'm affirming is the value. And specifically, this proposition that all men are created equal, which he calls actually in one of his speeches, his ancient religion. It's what he is alluding to. Here's where it gets blurred. I don't think he can conceive of any other nation carrying the torch of those values other than the United States. So even though maybe they are separate in his mind, in practice, to uphold the commitment to democracy is to ensure that the United States survives. And he makes that very clear in his various documents. If the nation collapses, this set of values is lost to the world. And so once you make that firm linking, it's not so surprising that people begin to totally conflate the two, so that the sacralization of the nation follows almost inevitably. Yes?
Yeah, so Dan's question about the audience got me thinking, would it be possible for him to have given the Almighty has its own purposes, God is judging us, in a eulogy-like context at Gettysburg? Like, is that, could he have said that?
So the question is, I'm just repeating the question that you asked me to, is let's remember, so I'm putting my own words here, let's remember, after all, he's giving a speech at the dedication, the ceremony where we're honoring people who've died. Would that really have been the proper time to lay into the various sins of the nation? And you're exactly right. And let me just suggest that I'm really not trying to say what I know is going on in Lincoln's mind. What I am trying to say is, how should we today think critically about what he actually said? And whatever's going in his mind, I think it would have been considered probably really poor form, if nothing else, if he said, I just want to remind you how fallen all these people were that died. And so that's a point we'll take it. I don't think it changes the fact that we put these words on the wall of the Lincoln Memorial, and they're arguably the most recognizable speech, one of the most recognizable speeches in the history of the world. Yes, Elwin.
So you say we don't know when his meditation was written, but do you have writings before the Second Inaugural that start to show that trend of talking about God having his own plans?
Yes, so the question here is, are there other writings that sort of are echoing the meditation on divine will in the period of 1864? And for purposes of time, I skipped over those. There are a few. He speaks to a sanitary fair. A sanitary fair was basically a fundraising venture for Union soldiers, and there were major ones in cities around the country. He speaks at one in Baltimore in early 1864, in which he basically says that man proposes and God disposes. He's suggesting that things don't unfold the way that we plan. He writes an old political acquaintance and a journalist in Kentucky in April of 1864, in which he says, "I plainly confess not to have controlled events, but that events have controlled me." Now that's not exactly the same thing, but he's still pointing to a plan of God, whatever it is, that transcends what he had in mind. And then he writes to a Quaker woman named Eliza Gurney, whose husband was actually a very prominent Quaker leader. And she actually gets two different personal audiences with the president during his presidency. He writes to her in the fall of 1864, where he says pretty much the same thing. None of that definitively proves the date for the meditation on divine will, but it seems to me that it's becoming a kind of recurring kind of emphasis from the spring of 1864 on to the Second Inaugural. Let's go over here. Mark, I'll come to you a second. Yes, sir.
I just noticed no one's giving you advice about your question, which is should I say something or not? And I'll give you a little advice. As a preacher, I just know how hard it is to talk about what's happening right now, so I hope you do. That's how I feel about it. Just because just the times we're living in are really hard, and it seems like there are many, many things happening that people are looking for a theological rationale for, and sometimes preachers are supplying that theological rationale in ways that are not helpful. And it seems to me we just need someone who's thought about these issues really deeply to say something. So that's my advice to your question.
I appreciate, well, thank you. I appreciate that very much. And
it's just very.
And I take that to heart. It's knowing exactly how to do that and praying for wisdom and clarity.
It's hard. Don't hear me saying it's a very easy thing to do. It's not at all.
Absolutely.
It's hard work. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Mark, you had a question.
So, kind of to echo what Dr. Esch said about it seemed the Gettysburg Address kind of sounding like a eulogy. Is there anything that any of the writings from Lincoln, because about 6 or 7 months before this, one of his sons, William Lincoln, died. Is there anything, any writings that would maybe show that, because this was his second son that died at that point, and no parent should have to outlive their own child. Is there anything that talks about his maybe like moving away from God and sort of like his like sovereignty and providence over these types of tragedies in his life?
So the question here refers to the fact that Lincoln loses a second child, and it's actually, I think, early 1862 when Willie dies. Is that having an effect on him, and maybe does it lead him even to pull away from some of his convictions about God's sovereignty? I don't have an answer that I'm confident with about that question. One of the things that you learn when you dig into this issue is that there is an enormous literature trying to estimate what Lincoln's faith was. And it's contradictory. If you're a historian and you're trying to be skeptical about the value of sources, you find reasons to doubt almost anything. There's a whole genre. And I gave a name to this genre, and I'm not going to remember it exactly, but it goes something like this. I was very close friends with Abraham Lincoln, although nobody ever knew it. He told me exactly what he believed at one time when everyone else was president is now dead. And that's the kind of thing that's going on here, right? So I just have to, personally have decided I have to be sort of agnostic on that question. There is suggestions that his minister in Washington was Presbyterian named Phineas Gurley. And that Gurley may be, we know that he's spending time with Lincoln, and maybe he keeps trying to assure Lincoln that his son is with God in eternity. What effect that has, again, it's just, we have to speculate. I think you had a question.
To answer your question again, I think actually in contrast with what Dr. Jordan said,
we're going to disagree.
I know, disagree with the doctor. That probably doesn't end well. I think it depends on what you feel, because this first Gettysburg Address directly correlates with the Christian nationalist sacralization that we see today. And if you see that as idolatry, then you almost have to say something about it, because you need to have this vicarious contrition for our enemies, if the Christian idolaters are our enemies, to where you need to stop their sin out of love for them. So then you would need to voice that opinion.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And whereas this comment sort of made me feel good, yours really is bothering me a lot.
This is a running theme of several classes.
So I appreciate what you're saying. I absolutely appreciate what you're saying. I thought a little bit, not a lot, about Christian nationalism. Given the definition that I've given for civil religion, which is the story we tell ourselves about the religious meaning of America, Christian nationalism may or may not fit that category. When individuals ask me questions about Christian nationalism, I've learned usually to say, tell me what you mean by that, because until you do, I'm not sure that we'll be talking about the same thing. One element of Christian nationalism can be a historical argument about the founding of the country, the values of prominent individuals. To the degree that we're talking about that, I think that fits in very well to what I mean when I talk about the story that we tell ourselves. To the degree that Christian nationalism is not about the past, but is simply an assertion about what the United States must and should be going forward, I think it's in a little bit different category. What I think Lincoln is doing is not saying the United States should be a Christian nation. I think he's treating the nation as if it is the church. And that's not really quite the same thing. And in parsing through the differences, I'm not real confident that I've done that yet. But I take your word to heart. I take your word to heart. So, maybe I'll write a book in which I trash the Gettysburg Address and then really offend this huge... Yes, sir.
I think the line that strikes me the most is his statement, the Almighty has his own purposes. And if there's an idolatry among Christians today, I think it may be the belief that somehow we have our own purposes and it is up to God to see his way clear as to how to support them.
So the comment here, which you may have heard or not, is the line, the Almighty has his own purposes, is maybe the most trenchant observation in the speech. And I think, you know, if I were forced right now to say what might we learn or what might we apply, I do think in the Second Inaugural that Lincoln is bringing together two things that are almost impossible to do simultaneously, which is to maintain a moral resolve, to firmly press on, to do the right, as he puts it, as God grants us to see the right, to the degree that we understand what God asks us to press on, but to attach to that a kind of humble recognition of our own limitations and of the potential temptation that we face to impute to our Creator our own agendas, our own values. So what I see here is a kind of humble determination, a moral resolve, coupled with a self-skepticism of sorts, that's based on a deep conviction of his own fallibility and the constant reminder that the Almighty has his own purposes. And actually, I think that is a marvelous model to try to emulate. Any other questions, thoughts? Right, I'm sure we're just about out of time.
We're about out of time, yeah.
Is it about that time?
I think so, yeah.
All right.
Please.
Can I just say it's been a wonderful, wonderful audience. Brilliant.